Hello. We'll start in a couple of minutes. I'll start now. So I'm going to discuss Catherine Morton's chapter about aesthetics and settler colonialism. And in the chapter, Morton argues that the visual representation of Indigenous women and girls in Canadian media can be thought of as a form of ideology that often justifies state negligence in cases of femicide. And also, Morton argues that aesthetics are not just about representing reality, they are about nation building and constructing a set of binary oppositions between good and bad, or rich and poor. And Morton argues that this construction of those who are deemed to be beautiful and healthy and those who are not is part of this effort to justify crime in service of nation building. So Catherine Morton's work is written from a feminist perspective, and Morton specifically looks at this idea of the body beautiful and the ways that national ideals of gender and femininity, of beauty, aesthetics, are always about race and class, nation building, and also violence. And the feminist movement and feminist theory have a long history of politicizing the body and how gender is staged in media, in film, in photography, in fashion, and also in national branding. So this is a clip about Laura Mulvey, who is a really well-regarded feminist theorist who came up with the term the male gaze. And what Mulvey argues is that the way that cinema often constructs women as characters is for their to be looked atness, that the way that women are often celebrated in mainstream television and film and advertising is not for what people do or say or any action, but for what Mulvey refers to as to be looked atness. And this to be looked atness appeals to what Mulvey terms the male gaze.
Hi, folks, and welcome to our unit on gender and spectatorship. We are going to be spending all of our time looking closely at, more or less, this one film, Vertigo, and this one text. So it's a lot less reading than the other weeks, though the reading is a bit harder. But it's also reading that I hope means something to you. This is a famous, famous text. It is responsible for the term male gaze, which has made its way into popular culture. So I hope that you get something out of this reading this text, even though it is quite a difficult read because it's so academic. So let's just try to wade through the text by looking closely at what Laura Mulvey herself says. She begins the paper by saying this paper intends to use psychoanalysis to discover where and how the fascination of film is reinforced by pre-existing patterns of fascination already at work within the individual subject and the social formation that have molded him. What is she saying? Well, she's basically saying, I have this discourse called psychoanalysis that has already helped us understand what the human subject is and how the human subject thinks. And she's saying, I can help you figure out how this fascination with this medium we call film and this thing we call narrative movies is tied to the psychoanalytic structures of human subjectivity. That is, the way people are according to this field of thought. She then says psychoanalytic theory is appropriate here as a political weapon, demonstrating the way the unconscious of patriarchal society has structured film form. Now it gives you a sense that what she's after is uncovering the way in which patriarchy works. That is the rule by men and masculinity that has seeped into civilization. She's trying to say that this has structured film form. So what does she mean by film form? Well, lucky for us, that's the whole point of this class. So she might look at this class with some skepticism and say, why are you thinking about the politics of form, right? Think about not just how films work with things like continuity editing or shot reverse shot or eyeline match or POV shots, but actually think about how these things might be tied to particular ideological structures. And it's not just these kind of editing terms, it's also importantly, and almost more so, classical Hollywood narrative. This is what we talked about in our last unit. What Laura Mulvey is doing is very much a continuation of what we did last unit, which was about narrative and narration. She's particularly interested in this idea. The character is the principal causal agency, and causality is the prime unifying principle. She wants to say, if that's the case, what does it mean that in 30s, 40s, and 50s Hollywood cinema, usually our principal causal agency is a man, often a heterosexual white man. And often when women are involved, they don't have agency, but are kind of acted upon. She is interested in this tendency and interested in what this tendency does in a world that subjugates women and is privileged according to men. Now, what about psychoanalytic theory? I'm not going to presume that you know what this is. I'm going to do a little bit to kind of at least give an introduction to what she means by psychoanalytic theory. So what is it? Psychoanalysis, first of all, is not psychology. They're not the same thing, though the histories of both disciplines kind of converge at certain points. It's a set of theories, you can say, and therapeutic techniques related to the study of the unconscious mind. And there's one big name here that's associated with this field, and it's Sigmund Freud. There's another name you might not know as much or as intimately, and that name is Jacques Lacan. And some of Lacan's theories are mentioned throughout the article. I'm not going to get too deep into them, But you should just know that Lacan is a kind of mid-20th century French thinker who draws a lot on Sigmund Freud, and they are both, by our estimation, in the field of psychoanalysis. So what are the main tenets of psychoanalysis? Well, you've probably heard of this notion of the unconscious, and the unconscious is related to the conscious. So the simplest way that we can summarize this is to say that the conscious is a small portion of the mind we're aware of in our day-to-day lives, the thoughts that I have, the sense perceptions that I have, the opinions that I form. The unconscious, however, according to the theory, is the desires and drives that we are unaware of, but often influence our actions and behaviors. Things like fears that I'm not quite, say, mindful of, unacceptable sexual desire that society, by virtue of its repression, will not encourage me to acknowledge. Or things like violence or violent motives, or things like shameful needs and experiences. These are often relegated to the unconscious for the psychoanalyst. Some more tenets of psychoanalysis that draw out of this tension between conscious and unconscious. So according to Freudian psychoanalysis, a person's development is determined by often forgotten events in early childhood rather than by inherited traits alone. Those forgotten events heavily revolve around the family unit, mother, father, child, and a discovery of sexual difference. That literally means the, say, primary or first citing of the fact that biologically male and biologically female individuals have different sex organs. That's literally what that means. That human behavior and cognition are largely determined by irrational drives that stem from repressed memories of these particular events. And finally, that the liberation from these effects of the repressed unconscious, effects which are often harmful or not good for me, is achieved by bringing this material into the conscious mind through therapeutic intervention. Right? Imagine the stereotype of the Freudian subject lying on Freud's couch, talking in a kind of automatic way, letting words just flow, and the Freudian kind of writing down the thoughts, interpreting them, imagining or trying to theorize what those words kind of suggest rather than what they say literally depict. Psychoanalytic feminism. If you're familiar with the theories of Freud, but not familiar with the idea of psychoanalytic feminism, you might think this seems like an oxymoron. Freud, after all, very much privileged the masculine subject. And many of his theories have been interpreted as misogynist themselves because they seem to suggest that man, by his very nature, has something that woman lacks, namely the phallus, right? However, there is a way in which a particular discourse of feminism draws on these collections of theories in order to diagnose why patriarchy exists in the first place, and then uses those principles to try to fight patriarchy by spreading the understanding of how it works, right? So these universal unconscious forces can be examined as explanations for all kinds of phenomena, including misogyny and its cultural exponents, including Hollywood cinema, right? So Mulvey herself will make a claim to this. She'll say there's an obvious interest in psychoanalysis for feminists, a beauty in its exact rendering of the frustration experienced under the phallocentric order. It gets us nearer to the roots of our oppression. So Mulvey doesn't even acknowledge, or Mulvey doesn't want to say that psychoanalytic feminism is an oxymoron. She wants to say that psychoanalysis in its very explanation gets us to the heart of this complete lack of power balance between men and women. And by understanding it, it'll get us nearer to the roots of our oppression, to our understanding of the roots of female oppression, of women's oppression. So what are the key tenets for Mulvey? What is she getting from psychoanalysis that informs her work in the visual pleasure essay? Well, namely, this idea that comes from this moment, and this might seem strange to you, and indeed it should seem strange, but really this is what she means by this term castration anxiety. Remember when I mentioned that the forgotten events that shape our desires and anxieties revolve around the discovery of sexual difference, where there's a particular narrative of discovery of sexual difference that happens to little boys, that the male fear of emasculation, that is, what a Freudian might diagnose as a general fear that men have of losing the power that they claim or that they have been given is founded upon the childhood discovery of sexual difference. That is, when boys discover that cis girls, biologically female children, don't have penises. And I know it seems rather strange to say that a fear of loss of power revolves around a discovery of sex organs, but this is kind of a cultural myth making attached to, say, things like having a mother, a father, or things like discovering sexual difference. Okay, so if men fear castration, and this is where the visual pleasure and narrative cinema argument starts to begin, right? Mulvey will say something like, if men fear castration, not consciously, of course, you might say, then the image of woman signifies the threat of castration. So, wow, how are men going to deal with that? And you see the logic here. She says, if men fear castration, right, the loss of their power symbolically through the loss of their phallus or their penis, then the image of woman that is a kind of person who lacks the phallus would itself signify the very threat of castration in her theory. Then how are men who are watching these movies or making these movies going to deal with that idea that woman signifies threat? And this is where the two parts of the male gaze come in, right? This video, we're only going to talk about the first part of the male gaze, which is the one that I think most of us are most familiar with. The idea of looking at women as objects, right? If women pose a threat, strategy number one is to subjugate the image of woman by objectifying the image of woman. She says in their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact so that they can be said to connote to be looked at-ness. Women displayed as sexual object is the leitmotif of erotic spectacle. Just think about the very idea of these kinds of images and how these are pervasive images in society. They're not just merely confined to the 1930s and 40s with, say, sex symbols like Marilyn Monroe. They are all over the place. They are not just part of cinema. They are also part of painting. They are part of civilization writ large. So I want you just to think about this. And if you Google male gaze, you'll get images like this, right? Where you have a male looker and a female person who is there as if to be looked at is her sole purpose of living, right? This is the theory. So she will say, Mulvey will say, the structure of looking in classical films encourages the spectator to objectify women with their gaze. And when I have italics here, it means I'm paraphrasing, not quoting. Notice how Scotty here is looking at Madeline, but she doesn't look back. He's looking and she exists to be looked at. So it's important to notice moments in these films in which men look at women, but women don't look back at them with the same level of power, with the same connotation of objectification, right? That voyeurism, that idea of looking without getting a look back, is emblematic of the lack of balance in the power structure, where one person looks off on a man and the other person is being looked at. And here's where the theory gets interesting, because Mulvey is tying the idea that men look at women in films not just as just a claim by itself, that men shouldn't look at women because it objectifies them. No, she takes that and she actually says that it is baked into the way in which narrative works in films. And she'll say that the look halts narrative progress. She'll say something like classical films will often have moments like these where the narrative is suspended so we can appreciate the spectacle of a woman performing. And in many ways, this is literal. There are many, many, many examples of classical Hollywood films in which the narrative flow will stop so that we'll have a moment where, say, maybe a female character or not even characters will perform on a stage and our protagonist simply looks and then the characters look, and then the spectator is allowed to look and allow the kind of flow of narrative progress suspend for a little bit as everyone's ogling women who are singing or dancing or what have you. But in Rear Window, we have an example of this, which is almost a kind of meta version. Check it out.
No, Lisa, I don't think he did.
What do you think?
Well,
I will rephrase the question.
thank you. Yes, I like it.
So notice that this is a pivotal scene in the film, or rather, it's right before a pivotal scene in the film when the woman screams because her dog has died. This is at the moment in which almost everything is lost for Jeff because he has been delivered a kind of death blow of evidence by his friend Doyle. But at this moment, this is a kind of interim moment where it's almost as if we, alongside Jeff, are going to be given the chance to simply look. And Jeff's kind of his performance here is very much giving off the idea of an objectifying look, right? His eyes move upward even before he's able to remove his glass from his face, right? The eye kind of says everything. And what do we get? An eye line match, right? An eye line match that shows us the object of his gaze. It's Lisa, his girlfriend, who has been wearing fabulous clothes throughout the film, but here she's wearing something a bit more revealing with a connotation of sexuality, kind of nightgown. But interestingly, of course, Hitchcock, who seems to be privy to the kinds of structures that Mulvey is talking about, has this moment interrupted by narrative. So not only would you say generally that the look halts narrative progress, in this instance, we get it right back to narrative progress. The narrative progress signified by the scream also halts the look or the cessation of narrative for the sake of pure objectifying visual pleasure. And
this is me booking.
And we can see something similar in here, not quite as meta, but absolutely illustrating what Mulvey says about the look halting narrative progress. Just think about the time it takes for when Jimmy Stewart looks screen left for us to find Madeline, right? It's almost here as if the slow movement of the camera, which moves backward, right? And then slowly finds Madeline. It's almost as if the way the camera moves and the mise-en-scène of the scene forces us to do the very thing that Jimmy Stewart is doing, which is pick out Madeline from the crowd, right? Because there's this moment where it stops. And our eyes are darting around the screen because we aren't told explicitly where the object of our interest is, but the mise-en-scène, that is lighting and costume, will eventually tell us that right there is the object of our gaze, right? The green pops out against the red, right? That's just kind of color theory. The two opposite colors clash in a way. No one else is wearing green to pop out against the red of the walls. And of course, the lightness, right? The bright platinum blonde hair also signifies just a graphic contrast that might catch our eye, so that we are forced to experience what it is like to pick out someone from the room, right? And we have this long lingering camera that really slows down narrative progress so that we can feel the experience of looking in the way that Scotty is looking. You know, interesting to note that this is a real POV shot, one that represents the position of Jimmy Stewart, but this whole thing is something like a POV shot, but not at all. A camera movement and an angle that gives us the impression of what it's like to be like Scotty, and yet we are completely different from Scotty at a different point in the room. Mulvey will continue. When women appear on screen as erotic objects, they often halt narrative progression, and we are encouraged to possess them with our gaze, right? You can also see a similar version of this here in this sequence, just to show you that Hitchcock is thinking about these issues, that he's creating parallels. Notice just how structurally similar this sequence is. This is after Scotty has brought back Madeline after her dip into the water, and now he's brought her back to his own apartment, right? He's kind of setting the stage for almost a romantic encounter, and yet the sequence begins with this utter lack of balance of power, where he is the one who possesses the gaze, and he is located here on the right side of the frame. He looks left toward where Madeline is, and then the camera almost simulates the time it takes for him to look by beginning to rotate in that direction, just like we got in the Ernie sequence. But here we'll get new pieces of information that make things a bit darker and a bit more sexually objectifying. For one, of course, if we have been paying attention, we notice that in our journey from the looker to the looked, we see Madeline's dress not on her, right? Suggesting that at some point, Scotty maybe undressed her, right? Giving us this imagination of this kind of sexual display of power, something that we should be kind of nervous about in a sense, if we are really paying attention to the film, right? There is sexual subjugation happening, and it's being suggested merely with the movement of the camera. And I'll give you one more example of the look halting narrative progress with this famous shot from the film. It's yet another example in which a visual display seems to slow down narrative progress. And it's a shot that really participates in the history of cinema. It's a shot that should remind us of a famous shot from The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy opens the door to Oz just like this. And what we get is a world of Technicolor. Here, we get a similar thing. A kind of dark beige and brown alleyway is turned into a complete visual display of vibrantly colored flowers, right? And we're not getting narrative right now. We're simply getting the idea of one person looking at another who is not aware of that person looking at them. But of course, as we'll talk about later in this series of video lessons, when you watch the film again, you'll realize that it's not as simple as that. Madeline, in fact, knows exactly what she's doing. She is in on this whole display, and she has created herself as an image to be buffeted by the saturated color brilliance of the image that these flowers provide. So these are examples not only of what Mulvey is talking about, but they're examples that think about the issues that Mulvey is talking about. So I'm going to leave you there, and next time we'll start with the second part of the male gaze, identifying with a male protagonist. I'll see you next time.
Smooth melting linen.
So that is a clip about the male gaze. And this construction of women in cinema historically as people who exist to be looked at, but who cannot look back, is, I think, connected to the idea of consent. Consent is agreement or permission expressed through affirmative, voluntary words or actions that are mutually understandable to all parties involved to engage in a specific sexual act at a specific time. Consent can be withdrawn at any time as long as it is clearly communicated. So when one does not look back, I think it is indicative of a lack of consent. And so film, television, media representation often construct these very sexist, I would argue, portrayals of women who exist to be looked at and also to be acted upon. And in their most extreme renderings, misogynistic imagery can be used to justify rape culture, or can be part of the kind of rhetoric that often informs violence against women and girls and gender-based violence and its normalization. So in 2011, 36-year-old Cindy Gladu, a Cree woman, bled to death in a hotel bathtub in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Bradley Barton, a white man who worked as a trucker, had purchased her sexual services on at least 2 occasions, including the night she died. In 2015, Barton was tried for the murder of Cindy Gladue. The defense maintained that Cindy had bled to death from a tear that occurred during an episode of consensual rough sex when Barton inserted his fists into her vagina. The Crown argued that the 11-centimeter wound had been caused by a knife used by Barton. In a bid to demonstrate its theory about the knife, and on the advice of the senior pathologist in the case, the Crown introduced as evidence Cindy Gladue's vagina, tissue apparently severed from the rest of her body. The judge permitted the severed part of the pelvic area to be viewed on a screen, behind which the pathologist testified as he pointed to the actual tissue. Barton was acquitted of all charges, and the case is on appeal. So, the essay by Catherine Morton then specifically discusses aesthetics and the ways that Indigenous women and girls and Indigenous people are represented in media, particularly after instances of crime. So when people who occupy positions of social or political power, who have a great deal of what Pierre Bourdieu would refer to as cultural capital, which is non-financial assets, but still forms of capital. When these people who have this form of capital or clout in society commit crimes against those who do not, there are often a whole series of negative things that are said about victims of crime. And the use of imagery and the use of narrative to stigmatize victims of crime is recurring in media and also even in trials. So Cindy Gladue was referred to over and over again as, quote, a native prostitute. And I think it was said over 50 times that she was, quote, a native prostitute. And it's similar to George Floyd, who was referred to as having a counterfeit $20 bill after he was murdered. So these people are then being put on trial after they have been murdered. And this kind of judgment of someone who is acted upon but cannot act happens throughout the whole course of one's life. That is what I would argue. And even after one dies, they can be put on trial. And there are similar examples, and I would argue this one of the most recurring examples in media and also in law is this idea of provocation. So historically, when people were sexually assaulted or victims of rape, the idea of provocation was often used to put a victim on trial after she was sexually assaulted. So how someone dresses, what someone wears, consumption of alcohol. And media then and visual representation can impact the ways that people are perceived of as those who are deserving of legal rights and who can be victimized and who can take legal action against their aggressors, as opposed to those who will be exonerated of all crimes because of their institutional power or because of their cultural capital. So if cultural capital refers to non-financial assets, then what I would argue is that whiteness and masculinity is a form of cultural capital. So Bradley Barton has had many trials, and I'll discuss the trials of Bradley Barton and also the media's depiction of Indigenous women and girls, and specifically this idea of aesthetic innocence that Morton discusses in her chapter. So Catherine Morton's
So you think-
chapter is published in a book called The Politics of Ugliness, and Morton is specifically interested in how this binary of ugly and beautiful is often one that is used to construct this image of whiteness as being a very specific type of innocence and a specific type of beauty that is also associated with morality.
Wicks, do you really? First up, we've got Shake.
We have breaking news out of Edmonton. Bradley Barton has been sentenced to 12 and a half years for killing Cindy Gladue, an Indigenous mother of 3. Gladue was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room a decade ago, and Barton, a former truck driver, was found guilty of manslaughter in February. A warning to our viewers that this story contains details which may be disturbing. The CBC's Paige Parsons is in Edmonton, and she was listening to the sentencing. Paige, what can you tell us about what the judge had to say?
Well, in the moment before he delivered that sentence, he told Bradley Barton that there was simply an intolerable level of blameworthiness in this case. And he ultimately sentenced him to 12 and a half years. And with time already served, it'll be about 11 years and 200 days that Barton has left to serve. Now, this was for a manslaughter conviction in the death of a young mother, Cindy Gladue, who died back in 2011. It followed basically what the judge described today as an injury caused by a sexual assault. She bled to death in Barton's hotel room at the time. And so the sentence he landed on is about the midpoint between what the defense and Crown prosecutors were seeking, but he said it came down to aggravating factors, such as that Barton, didn't try to get Gladue help. He didn't tell the truth when he was speaking to police and others after the incident. And that's how they arrived at that sentence of, over 12 years.
Now, this case has been going on for over a decade. This was actually the second time that Barton has been tried in the death of Cindy Gladue. What has happened since then?
The original trial, he went to trial on a murder charge back in 2015, and he was acquitted initially. But that sparked, large protests in Alberta here and elsewhere because of the way that Cindy Gladue was spoken about during the trial. They relied on some, myths and stereotypes about Indigenous women as well as sex workers. She was, because Gladue had participated in a cash transaction for sex with Barton, but ultimately that went up through the appeal court in Alberta to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they ended up retrying him for manslaughter here today. And so it's been a really long journey. It's been very hard on her family, who in their victim impact statements during this trial shared just, what a nightmare it's been for this to go on for decades, and how much they really miss Cindy. So the family had said previous to the sentencing that they were hoping that after today, they'd be able to get some closure.
All right. Thank you so much, Paige. That's the CBC's Paige Parsons in Edmonton. And if you need support and would like to talk to a counselor, you can call an independent toll-free line. That number is 1-844-413-6649. It is available free of charge, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
So Bradley Barton's appeal was dismissed in the killing of Cindy Gladue 1 month ago. And the trials involved many attempts to appeal, but So at the end of January in 2024, the Court of Appeal of Alberta rejected Barton's request that his conviction in Gladew's 2011 death in an Edmonton hotel room be vacated and a new trial ordered. So for the remainder of the lecture, I will discuss these 5 points. Firstly, I will talk about Cindy Gladue. Then I will discuss ugliness and class warfare. Then I will talk about race, gender, eugenics, and the body. Finally, biopolitics. I will discuss Michel Foucault. And finally, I will discuss images. And I will draw on the work of cultural studies scholars to discuss images. I would argue that language and image production is central to understanding how the general public or a country of people who might be, what I would argue, people who have a certain national consciousness, make sense of nation building. The ways that the Canadian media and the image production that surround missing and murdered Indigenous women appear often minimize the lives specifically of Indigenous women. And there's often this sense that the criminal justice system will not work in the same way against the perpetrators of this violence. So the use of language again and again to say disparaging things about Indigenous women is, I think, part of the reason that there's so many appeals and there's often a sense of indifference. So in the trials, this lawyer who's Peter Sankoff, who is Bradley Barton's lawyer, has consistently said things like this. You try spending 6.5 hours in police custody. That is not a pleasant time, no matter how many coffees they bring you. You're not allowed to leave. That's the problem. So this person is accused of murdering a woman, and he is accused of inserting a knife into her body and killing her. But there is this constant sense that he is being somehow discriminated against as a white man. The image production has consistently showed photos of Cindy Gladue rather than Bradley Barton. And some of the photos have involved images of her smoking. The images are not really flattering. And I would argue that in a predominantly white country like Canada, where a lot of the media, specifically television, fashion, news, often glorifies whiteness as a gendered and feminine ideal, that the image production is central to the trivializing of the lives of non-white women. So, as I said, Cindy Gladue was referred to as a prostitute or sex worker over 50 times. And the use of this language and also the images that accompanied these trials, as well as this constant narrative of Bradley Barton as someone who was not being treated fairly and was brought many cups of coffee, but still was not receiving royal treatment, is perhaps telling. So Catherine Morton has written this essay, which is part of our syllabus for the term ugliness as colonial violence, mediations of murdered and missing Indigenous women. In the public discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women, ugliness has acted as an essential descriptor. Ugliness as embodied in damaged bodies, disease, deviant behavior, and wasted body from substance abuse permeates the framing of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Ugliness allows for the violence of these cases to become inevitable and naturalized. More sinister still, ugliness diminishes or at least neutralizes violence, both chronic and acute, faced by Indigenous women. What value is there in naming a missing Indigenous woman as a drug-addicted sex worker, other than to construct her victimhood as not only ugly and shocking, but unavoidable? Patricia Hill Collins is a Black feminist theorist whose work I have previously discussed, and Hill Collins discusses the idea of controlling images. And what Hill Collins argues is that because of the history of slavery, there are often extremely negative images of Black women and girls. And Hill Collins refers to a whole set of tropes in the media and fashion and film that often structure very negative attitudes towards Black women. And I would argue that this same pattern of viewing exists in cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Since
So this is a clip about how racism structures violence, and specifically in these cases of murder of Indigenous women and girls.
was first reported missing in Wyoming earlier this month until her remains were found later, the case of 22-year-old Gabby Petito has captured widespread media attention. But tens of thousands of people are reported missing or murdered every year in the U.S., and people of color don't get nearly the same level of attention, particularly Indigenous and Native Americans. Amna Nawaz has our conversation.
Judy, in Wyoming alone, 710 Indigenous people were reported missing between 2011 and 2020. In fact, although Indigenous people make up only 3% of the state's population, they accounted for more than 21% of homicide victims over the last decade. And the problem is not limited to Wyoming. Native women are murdered at rates 10 times the national average, a pattern that's reflected in a report from Abigail Echo Hawk. She's the chief research officer for the Seattle Indian Health Board and the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute. She joins me now. Abigail, welcome to the News Hour. Thank you for making the time. You have called it a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Just give us a sense of scale and scope. What are we talking about?
We're talking about a crisis that didn't just start 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but one that has started and has been going on for more than hundreds of years. We have seen Native women go missing and murdered at astronomical rates. But despite knowing this within our communities and having the stories, we see an underreporting of them in the data, which makes it harder for us to advocate for and to show the disparity that exists in our communities and the loss of our loved ones.
Tell me why that underreporting is happening. What part of the system is failing?
In 2018, my organization put out a report in which we found that law enforcement agencies were either not collecting race and ethnicity of victims. We found database systems that would default to white if race and ethnicity wasn't collected, or they would visually look at somebody and decide what their race and ethnicity is. And as a result of that, we are finding a complete underreporting. And in fact, I've actually seen Native families having to fight to have their young relatives classified correctly because somebody mistook them for another race and they weren't reported as American Indian or Alaska Native. It's a systematic problem, and as a result of that, we have all of the stories of our communities, but we fight to show it in the data.
Tell me about what you hear from families about their missing loved ones, their murdered loved ones. What kind of stories do you hear from them about the issues they run into in reporting this and in getting justice?
We often will hear stories of individuals who attempt to report their loved ones missing, and officers will tell them, well, maybe she just ran away. Was she out drinking? Does she do sex work? We see the prejudices and stereotypes against Indigenous peoples and people of color play out in the underreporting because nobody's listening to us. We also see a maze of jurisdiction that exists only for Indigenous peoples in this country because of the laws that exist on tribal lands. I worked with a family where they actually spent 3 days of law enforcement trying to decide who had jurisdiction. And in that 3 days, their loved one remained missing and nobody was looking for them.
You mentioned these jurisdictional issues, and a lot of people think, well, that's just limited to when you're talking about tribal lands versus non-tribal lands. But your report was based on 71 urban cities across 29 states. So is this an issue regardless of where you live?
Absolutely. And we see this systematic issue playing out as a result of institutional and structural racism. In 2018, I put out another report related to high rates of sexual violence against American Indian, Alaska Native women in the city of Seattle. Out of the 94% of the women we talked to, 94% of them had been sexually assaulted in their lifetime, but only 8% of them saw a conviction of their rapist within the justice systems. We see a lack of accountability. We see a lack of investigation. And again, the systematic issues that place the blame of our victimization on our community instead of looking at why are we being targeted and why are we being victimized at such high rates.
Abigail, we're talking about this because of this intense media interest in the case of Gabby Petito. It's part of what our late news hour anchor and colleague Gwen Eiffel once referred to as missing white women syndrome, right? The spotlight that's granted to white women, but not often to women of color. Your organization has actually studied that, right? The comparison between how these stories are treated. What did you find?
In our report, we actually found of the cases that we looked at, 95% of them weren't covered in the media. And this didn't mean that there weren't videos. It didn't mean that there wasn't active ways to put this in the media. It's just nobody's cared. And I actually contributed to the report in Wyoming that showed more than 700 people missing. And that report, which came out in January of this year, again, had very little coverage. And as the Indigenous community, we mourn for the family of anybody whose loved one goes missing and murdered. But what we demand is equity in this kind of coverage because the lives of our women also matter.
In just a few seconds we have left, what does it take to fix this, to change this?
We need to see not only media coverage, but we need to see changes in policies. We need to see programming and interventions to understand that as Native women and Native people, we aren't higher risk of going missing and murdered because there's something wrong with us. We are at higher risk because there is systems of inequity in this country that place us at higher risk. And those are the systems we have to address. And it's going to take the entire community of the United States to come together and do that with us.
That is Abigail Echo Hawk, Director of the Urban Indian Health Institute, joining us tonight. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So I think in order to understand what structures violence and the justification of disposability of certain people's lives, one has to return to colonial history. So Sherene Razack draws on Francois Vergas, who states that the fabrication of disposable peoples throughout history points to the permanence of a specific construction of otherness, in which the excess of enjoyment is expressed through the transformation of a human being into matter. So as post-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon wrote, "You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich." And Fanon was discussing the ways that colonialism supported this mythology of whiteness that allowed for the theft of other people's property and criminal behavior. So there are often a lot of images produced throughout colonial history which equated whiteness with morality. A rhetoric of cleanliness and godliness was used to script brown and black bodies as dirty, And there are often these associations in very old soap ads from the 19th century between skin color and morality, and also godliness, which, and these ads existed around the time at the height of European colonial expansion and were used to kind of garner support for colonial expeditions. This kind of use of white skin as an image of morality was used to signify a psychic and discursive chain of association between race, hygiene, and morality. Anne McClintock is a well-cited post-colonial scholar who discusses the relationship between soap advertising and colonialism, with soap being emblematic of the cult of domesticity and the rise of imperialism in the 19th century. So this construction of white skin and white femininity as being innocent and moral and clean was used to justify many things. Firstly, domesticity and the valuing of gendered labor in the home, or a gendered power division of labor, where women were thought to do household work and could not participate in formalized labor, or could not do formalized labor outside of the home. Whiteness as a moral category was also used to justify crime. And to justify the seizure of people's property in the colonies, war, and also rape committed by colonizers. Morality and whiteness was also then equated with beauty, that if one was white, moral, innocent, and beautiful, they could not be a pedophile or a rapist or a thief, all of which is obviously not true. So McClintock states that both the cult of domesticity and the new imperialism found in soap an exemplary mediating form. The emergent middle class values monogamy, clean sex, which has value, industrial capital, clean money, which has value, Christianity, being washed in the blood of the Lamb, class control, cleansing the great unwashed, and the imperial civilizing mission, washing and clothing the savage, could all be marvelously embodied in a single household economy. The 19th century ushered in an era of soap advertising, espousing the ideologies of empire through images such as white children washing black children, and the use of obscene metaphors that associated whiteness with moral hygiene, health, and superiority of the imagined white race. So I'll discuss these ideas further when we talk about the book that I've written for the rest of the class. And like Catherine Morton, I'm interested in the relationship between aesthetics, race, and innocence, and also nation building, and the ways that aesthetics, particularly in a time of social media, film, and television, can be associated with power. So irrespective of work or economic capital or education, a certain aesthetic ideal can be used to signify power. And I would argue that class antagonism is often an aesthetic battle in this time period. The battle over images, including images of beauty, of morality, images of interest, is really an ongoing form of class antagonism. So the depiction of Cindy Gladue as in rather unflattering ways after her death, the use of very grainy imagery, and simultaneously the language of Cindy Gladue as, quote, a native prostitute, as opposed to Bradley Barton, who is being, I guess, stopped from living his very nice, clean, normal white life with this trial. And the constant mention in the media that he needs more support, or he's being inconvenienced by the criminal justice system, is really, I think, a question of class antagonism. So Marx wrote that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class, which is the ruling material force of society, is as at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class, which has the means of material production at its disposal, has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships, the dominant material relationships grasped as ideas, hence of the relationships which make the one class the ruling one, therefore the ideas of its dominance. So it is interesting to think about class antagonism in gender terms in this time period. In a different time period, the time of Marx, the division of labor was often quite gendered. So men worked outside the home, women would not, and would engage in domestic labor or child rearing. This has changed, and I would argue that the kind of antagonism between women of color and white women is really about the class structure. And there has been a lot of US press about this kind of antagonism, and specifically instances where Black American families or African American families have argued that white women harass them when they want to use swimming pools or use public services. And I would argue that this is really a form of class antagonism. The control over the mind and who has the right to control certain people's ideas, including ideas of what constitutes a family or what constitutes beauty or what constitutes crime, is really a form of class antagonism. The individuals composing the ruling class possess, among other things, consciousness, and therefore think. Insofar, therefore, as they rule as a class and determine the extent and compass of an epoch, it is self-evident that they do this in its own range. Hence, among other things, rule also as thinkers, as producers of ideas, and regulate the production and distribution of the ideas of their age. Thus, their ideas are the ruling ideas of the epoch. So it's interesting to think about who is the ruling class and why in white settler Canada. So irrespective of education, hard work, property ownership, any form of kind of class mobility, I think it is still possible for people to try to assert themselves as the ruling class because they are white settlers. And I think that this is going to pose an ongoing problem for the Canadian economy. So in an age in a country where royal power, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie are contending for mastery, and where, therefore, mastery is shared, the doctrine of the separation of powers proves to be the dominant idea and is expressed as an eternal law. So this eternal law of the aristocracy is also about race and about this construction of whiteness as being deserving of exoneration of crimes and also deserving of capital, irrespective of work. So the division of labor, which we already saw above as one of the chief forces of history up till now, manifests itself also in the ruling class as the division of mental and material labor, so that inside this class one part appears as the thinkers of the class, its active conceptive ideologists, who make the perfecting of the illusion of the class about itself their chief source of livelihood. So we can think about this in terms of knowledge production, and I've discussed the term epistemic violence, which is from the writings of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, who is a very well-regarded academic. And Spivak has discussed the ways that knowledge production epistemology is the study of knowledge. Knowledge production has always been a part of the history of colonialism and colonial violence. So the ruling class then has this group of thinkers in its class, and they are its active conceptive ideologists who make the perfecting of the illusion of the class about itself their chief source of livelihood. So it argued that anxieties about race and racism and whiteness in the university system is really about this kind of division of labor and this effort to keep the ruling class as a white settler class who can produce a great deal of mythologies about Canada and how great Canadians are and how nice Canadians are and the great Canadian family. Even if one of the great Canadian families was the family of Bradley Barton, who was married and I believe could have probably had children, but yes, he was a married white man who did insert a knife into a woman's vagina and kill her. So while the other's attitude to these ideas and illusions is more passive and receptive, because they are in reality active members of this class and have less time to make up illusions and ideas about themselves. So social media involves making up a lot of illusions and ideas about oneself, but that's not enough because one also needs a whole group of white academics or authors to also produce these illusions. And this is also true of the ruling class in general. So the Indian diaspora is full of really delusional narcissists who benefited from the caste system, which is again a form of settler colonialism and often involves destroying the Adivasi land, or the lands of Adivasi or tribal peoples in India, and then enslaving others. But these people can bring financial capital to Canada and then produce all these delusions of narcissism about beauty and greatness, and power and likability, irrespective of morality or actual action on behalf of others, ethics, or any real labor. So within this class, this cleavage can even develop into a certain opposition and hostility between the two parts, which, however, in the case of a practical collision in which the class itself is endangered, automatically comes to nothing, in which case there also vanishes the semblance that the ruling ideas were not the ideas of the ruling class and had a power distinct from the power of this class. So what is interesting in this time period is to think about Catherine Morton's writings, which is a part of our syllabus, which construct this binary between the ugly and the beautiful. And in a different time, the time of the aristocracy, many people did not need to work for a living. So if someone was beautiful and well rested and had an extensive amount of time on their hands, that might have meant that they were part of the aristocracy. But what does it mean now? Does it mean that someone does not have to work for a living and can then just call themselves middle class? The existence of revolutionary ideas in a particular period presupposes the existence of a revolutionary class. About the premises for the latter sufficient has already been said above. So this idea of the ruling class is also about nation building. Many people think that I am still a new immigrant to Canada, and also, I guess, a child who was moved with my parents or a student, an Indian student. And this is not true. So the question becomes why? And I think a lot of the image production in social media, in Canadian media, has to ignore the existence of a middle class or even a wealthy class of people who are not white, Christian, or Catholic settlers. So Catherine Morton argues that ugliness is central to the killing of Indigenous women and girls. And these disparaging images, which also correspond to images of white beauty and white power, are central to Canada's nation building. Ugliness is deployed in order to bolster the us versus them, colonizer versus colonized, civilized versus savage binaries that are inherent to the ongoing colonial project. Naming missing and murdered Indigenous women as ugly bodies makes it possible for these ugly victims to act as the perfect foil to civilized, innocent, and attractive white feminine colonial bodies. Ugliness allows for the maintenance of colonial power and equality by unequivocally naming Indigenous women as lesser than. What would it mean to move past a politics of ugliness in regard to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women? So I would argue that it is very difficult to make a convincing case that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the rights of women to be equal before law could ever really be actualized. And could I would argue that these ideas of gender-based equality, feminism, and rights are never really implemented because of this ongoing effort to create a ruling class that is white. And this often involves this kind of production of ideas of white innocence and white beauty, white normalcy, and white power. And this will affect the Canadian economy, and it will affect productivity, it will affect sales and business, and it will only really privilege a very, very small segment of society. So what would it mean to radically reconfigure the public discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women away from naming them as unattractive, undesirable, and therefore bodies that can be allowed to disappear? This chapter grapples with these questions and unpacks how the politics of ugliness are interwoven with settler colonial, racist, sexist, classist understandings of Indigenous women's experiences, particularly experiences of violence. I proceed to first outline the methodology for my analysis, follow this with a literature review that discusses how settler colonialism renders missing and murdered Indigenous women through a prism of ugliness, and finally Morton discusses her findings. So central to the making of this white settled class of people who do not have to necessarily compete is image production. And so when you have to actually compete fairly for anything, then you would perhaps want proper information, accurate knowledge. But when one wants to secure their position as, say, an aristocrat, you create a class of people who can produce positive ideas and images about you. And this is what Marx argued is central to the monopoly that the ruling class has over certain industries and over financial capital and property. So Giovanni comments that Indigenous women are largely portrayed as abject victims of poverty, their lives marked by alcohol and drug addictions, homelessness, high infant mortality, and morbidity rates, greater incidence of HIV, hepatitis infections, and gynecological cancers. In effect, they are represented as one of the most hopeless segments of society. There is a common treatment within the visual discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women that establishes Indigenous women as the most helpless and vulnerable, marginalized population. Anderson and Robertson comment that through the visual discourse, the press tells stories of violence against Indigenous women by constructing them as weak, backward, sexualized objects, anonymous, replaceable bodies. So again, I would return to Marx and think about the class structure, that this kind of production of those who are disposable is really about the maintenance of class structure. And this class structure, the ruling class, has power over these ideas, perhaps because of seizure of Indigenous land, and what the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report refers to as genocide. So central to image production and this control of ideas and what Spivak terms epistemic violence is rape culture. Rape culture is a setting studied by several sociological theories in which rape is pervasive and normalized due to societal attitudes about gender and sexuality. Behaviors commonly associated with rape culture include victim blaming, slut shaming, sexual objectification, trivializing rape, denial of widespread rape, refusing to acknowledge the harm caused by sexual violence, or some combination of these. It has been used to describe and explain behavior within social groups, including prison rape, and in conflict areas where war rape is used as psychological warfare. So the class structure is not only a class structure that is about the history of colonialism, but it is also a gendered class structure. So heterosexuality and the building of a cisgender heterosexual family often solidifies a gendered division of labor where women are called upon to do domestic labor, but cisgender women cannot enter the public sphere or compete with men. And I think that image production and disparaging images about women and also very positive image production and ideas about cisgender men are central to the maintenance of class structure, and class warfare is often fought using certain aesthetics, images, and language. Entire societies have been alleged to be rape cultures. And this is true of Canada, which has been referred to as a rape culture, particularly due to all of the violence against Indigenous women and girls. It is associated with rape fantasy and rape pornography. The notion of rape culture was developed by second wave feminists, primarily in the United States, beginning in the 1960s. Critics of the concept dispute its existence or extent, arguing that the concept is too narrow, or that although there are cultures where rape is pervasive, the idea of rape culture can imply that the rapist is not at fault, but rather the society that enables rape. Critics of that line of criticism have disputed the notion that only one party needs to be at fault, noting that the perpetrator can be primarily wrongdoer who helps cover it up or harass the victim acting as accomplices, and the wider society and culture can still be blamed for its collective influence on these individuals. Many movements have addressed rape culture, such as Slut Walk and Me Too. These movements have helped spread people's stories through hashtags and provide an online space where victims of different types of sexual violence can confide in each other. So, who can act upon and who can act, who consents and who cannot consent, is central to rape culture. And I would also argue that these power relations undercut every form of social relation, particularly among groups of people who are engaged in ongoing forms of class warfare because of their career interests and because of their desire to obtain capital and property. So who is kind of sold certain images and who must buy these images? Who is someone who has to follow behind someone or follow another person is really about the class structure and class warfare. And who can act upon someone who is acted upon is obviously about class warfare. And its most extreme class warfare can involve rape and murder of Indigenous women and girls and non-white women and girls whose destruction and actual murder helps secure a certain aristocracy. So Judith Butler has discussed this idea of grievable lives, and grievable lives is a concept from Judith Butler's writings, and Butler discusses the ways that epistemic violence, the knowledge that we produce about others and otherness, constructs certain lives to be grievable as opposed to others. So Morton draws on evidence or research regarding these missing posters. These missing posters have become very important within the public discourse of missing murdered Indigenous women, as they act as highly visual symbols of how Indigenous women are portrayed in cases of violence. So it's interesting to think about how social media and even fantasies about race permeate people's minds. Sometimes people think that because I'm a non-white woman, I would want them to talk to me or tell me things or impart ideology towards me or take care of me, or I would even care about their opinions. And in many cases, this could perhaps not be true. And this is again about a certain class of people who can produce ideas. And this kind of ongoing debate as academics is whether or not women of color, people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, Two-Spirit, queer people of color can produce knowledge. And yes, I believe that I can. So I'll finish there, and for the rest of the semester, we will discuss the book that I have written called Uncommitted Crimes, The Defiance of the Artistic Imagination. If you have questions about the presentation, please email me or please submit the presentation on Moodle. There were some technical difficulties that people told me about last night. And so, or sorry, it was the 28th when it was due, so it was last week. And so if you still haven't submitted the presentation, please email it to me. And you can also use WeTransfer to transfer the presentation to my account. Okay. Thank you.